My name is Dulcie O'Sullivan. I work with Seattle Department of Construction and Inspections in their code compliance section, and I lead a program called Renting in Seattle, which is sort of the outward facing content for landlords and tenants around the rental regulations that we enforce in the city. And I've worked for the department for 15 years. I spent 10 in the enforcement area. My colleague Alec, who's here today, also currently works in the enforcement section, and he provides technical assistance to landlords, as well as obviously processing complaints from tenants about violations. And so we're here today. We love having a chance to engage with our customers. We've been not able to do that much since COVID. And so today we're just doing an hour and a half presentation. So it's a small amount of time, and we have so much information to share, so we can't do it all. But today our focus is going to be on sort of a broad overview of our enforcement process, and then we're going to focus a little bit on economic displacement relocation assistance. That is the newest piece of legislation that has gone into effect regarding rental regulations. It was effective on July 1st. And so introductions, I've introduced myself. Alec, would you like to say hi?
Yes, hello. My name's Alec McCune. I work in the property owner tenant assistance unit at SDCI, and we have been sort of, we're especially when we get to the economic displacement relocation, I can add quite a bit. Dulcie is a great presenter, so we're lucky to have such a great presenter and knowledgeable, experienced person. And I don't know if everyone in the group here has, has their chat open. I'll be trying to keep an eye on that so that we can be gathering up any questions as we're going. And thanks for attending.
Great, thanks, Alec. So we're going to do a summary of the city rental housing laws and how we enforce them. A little bit about rental registration, and then we're going to focus in on economic displacement relocation assistance, or as we call it for short, EDRA. And then we'll have time for questions. Of course, questions are welcome throughout. I think Alec will probably respond to them in the chat. If there's anything that we can't answer today during the presentation, happy to take your information and we'll get the answer to you after. And then at the end, if there happens to be extra time, welcome to talk about anything that people in the group want to talk about. Not sure if there'll be that time, but that's fine if we do have time for that. So moving on, the city has obviously a substantial amount of rental laws. A lot of those have actually come on board in the last 5 to 10 years. In the early stages of my employment, rental laws had been static for a long time in the city, but because of the lack of affordable housing and the exponential population growth in Seattle, there have been additional housing protections put in place in the last few years because displacement is clearly an issue, especially for those who are earning on the lower end of the economic scale. And so throughout the city, throughout the rental life cycle, rental regulations and fair housing laws apply. And we look at the rental life cycle sort of in these stages. There's the preparation and everything leading up to renting a unit. Then there's the moving a tenant in, the time that the tenant lives there, and then obviously the move out. And throughout all of this, there are many regulations and fair housing laws that apply. And some examples you can see here. Before a place is ready, or before a unit is ready to go on the market, it needs to meet basic habitability standards. It needs to be registered. There are laws around advertising and marketing the unit. There are laws around the application process. On the move-in, there are limits to what you can charge for move-in costs in Seattle. For example, rental agreements are regulated. Service animals have protection under the law. And then on the rental duration, the rent payment, how it's paid is regulated, how a landlord can legally gain access. All the ADA laws, the Americans with Disability Act laws, apply throughout the rental housing cycle. There are requirements regarding repairs. There are lots of technical requirements regarding notices and issuing notices to a tenant. We have laws about roommates. And then at the moving out stage, there are laws around displacement, lease renewal. In Seattle, you have to have a just cause to terminate a tenant, and there are specific ones that apply. The security deposit return is regulated, retaliation, and also eviction defenses apply. So a lot of laws, and I would say that if you have a rental property, it really is like having a business. It's not an uncomplicated endeavor. And so I would say that, to the landlord community, of which I am also a member, I have a condo in Seattle that I rent. If you don't have the time or the knowledge or the capacity, it's better to engage a professional property manager, outfitter, or somebody that would be able to give it proper attention, because there are a lot of rules for sure. Okay, so the housing protections in Seattle that are enforced, there are two main types. There's our department, Seattle Department of Construction and Inspections, and we are responsible for enforcing habitability standards. So that's the physical condition of a rental housing unit. Rental regulations, which apply to sort of the administration side of landlording and being a tenant. So that's, rental agreements, all the paper trails, notices, documents, anything that's sort of contractual around renting. That's what that applies to. And then the land use code, that covers a multitude of areas too, but it basically refers to how a piece of property can be used legally and what's permitted on that piece of property. So it could be, a junk storage issue that would fall under a land use code. It could be an illegal unit that isn't safe. For example, a basement unit that does not have egress, and that would fall under a land use code. Running a business in a residential area, that would also be a land use code issue. So there's a lot that we cover. And then the second type of rental housing protections are based on protected classes. And there's a link there to the Seattle Office for Civil Rights website listing out the substantial list of protected classes we do have in the city. And this is basically around people's civil rights. And so it includes things like first in time, which is a requirement that landlords offer a unit to the first complete application they receive, which is basically designed to protect people from discrimination or implicit bias when they apply for housing. Fair chance housing, which is the protection for people who have had criminal convictions in their past. For example, that is also a protection that is enforced by Office for Civil Rights. They also would be the enforcement agency for any reasonable accommodation or modification requests So that mainly would involve people with disabilities who have asked for some type of accommodation from their landlord. And for example, if the landlord is not engaging or not responding appropriately, that would be something that the Office of Civil Rights would get involved in. So those are the two main types of housing protections in Seattle, and we are the two agencies that enforce, and we work closely together as well in our education and outreach, because it's difficult for people who are not obviously working in the city in these departments to know what's what. And so we try and make it simple. If you have any questions or issues, there's one number to call, and then we can make sure we get you to the right place if there is something to do with enforcement. So this is what our department looks at when we are advising a landlord whether their unit is ready to rent. First of all, it's required since 2014 that the rental regulation inspection ordinance requires that every rental unit registers and renews every 2 years. And this is a really fundamental piece because prior to this, we did not know how many rental units we had in Seattle. It's difficult to make policy or know what should what's needed or what the condition of the housing stock is if we don't know. So that's why it's required. And basically what it does is it ensures that the minimum standards in the unit are met in order to make it rentable. And minimum standards apply to space and occupancy. So, for example, rooms have to have a minimum square footage, light and ventilation. There have to be operable windows and adequate airflow in a unit. All of the sanitary areas where there is plumbing have to be up to code and hygienic. So kitchens, bathrooms. Structurally, when we look at the roofs, foundations, chimneys, anything that has masonry or that's structural needs to be in proper condition. Mechanically, the heating system, electrical, all of that has to be safe and adequate for the needs of the property. Fire and safety standards exist for stairs, exit, egress, which is a way of getting out of the property in an emergency situation, smoke alarms, carbon monoxide alarms, and then things like security with entry locks and observation ports. So all of these standards have to be met before a unit is considered habitable to rent, and it has to be registered. And every 5 to 10 years, units are inspected sort of randomly through a drawing system. And obviously, if a tenant complains about a housing condition, then inspections happen at that time. But other than that, for the purposes of the registration, it's every 5 to 10 years. And there is a link there at the bottom to the rental registration inspection ordinance checklist, which every landlord has to basically sign and self-certify that their unit meets these standards in order for it to be registered and rentable. So when a rental agreement is terminated, and there are specific reasons only that under which a rental agreement can be terminated by a landlord.
Like landlord training.
Landlord. And what are you hearing are the greatest needs?
See, I'm sorry. Let me take care of that. That shouldn't bother us again. Thank you.
No worries, no worries. So some rental termination notices require payment of relocation assistance to the tenants who are displaced. And I just wanted to give it like a little brief overview of that before we start focusing on the economic displacement. So the displacement by development, which is very evident at the moment, is when a tenant or a household is displaced because the building they live in is going to be demolished or go through a substantial rehab, or there's a change of use. So, for example, it could be an apartment building that's going to be turned back into a hotel, as an example, or the removal of use restrictions, and that would refer to tax incentives and subsidies that apply to a unit expiring, and that causing a tenant to be displaced. And so all of those reasons would be covered under the Tenant Relocation Assistance Ordinance, or TRAO for short. And that is a licensing process that owners and developers have to go through in order to legally get the tenants out. And it has two main benefits. One is the time, because it's about a 6-month period between the time a landlord or a developer would give notice of plans to develop the property and the time that the tenant would actually have to leave. And then for those who are income eligible, and that's at 50% or below the median income, it's pretty low, they would also get relocation assistance, and they have to apply for that relocation assistance through our department, and we do the review to see about income eligibility. And then with this particular ordinance, the city pays 50% of the relocation cost, and the owner or developer pays the other 50%. So that's one way that relocation assistance has to be paid to a displaced household when it's for development purposes. The second here on the list is an illegal unit, and that sort of falls under that land use code that I referred to earlier. If a unit exists in a property and it's not permitted, and it can't be permitted because, for example, it would be too expensive for a landlord to bring it up to code, or it just can't be brought up to code, then it needs to be discontinued. And that would result in having to terminate the rental agreement, and that would require payment of relocation assistance to a tenant. The third one on the list there is an emergency order, and those are generally situations where there's something imminently hazardous to health and safety, like a lack of power, lack of water, if there was a catastrophic flood or something like that. There can be lots of reasons that create an emergency order condition, but if it's found to be the responsibility of the owner that the emergency order or the emergency condition came about, then the owner does have to pay relocation assistance to tenants who have to move out because the unit cannot be restored to a safe and healthy standard. And that generally happens very, very quickly because it is emergency conditions. So that brings us to the star of our show, which is the Economic Displacement Relocation Assistance Ordinance. And this happens when a rent increase of 10% or more is given in a 12-month period to an income eligible household. That's how it's triggered. So it went into effect on July 1st, 2022, and it's an important thing to note the date because if a notice was issued prior to that date, it would not be necessarily subject to this ordinance. But if a notice was issued prior to July 1st, and then a second notice was issued after July 1st, and both of those notices happened to total 10% within the same 12-month period, then that notice prior to July 1st would actually count because it's contributing to the 10%. But at least one notice or all notices have to be issued on or after July 1st for this ordinance to apply. When a landlord raises rent by 10% or more, whether it's in one fell swoop or whether it's over a period of 12 months, they need to use a specific notice. And I've put a link there to the notice. We can take a closer look at that in a little bit. I'll double back. But this notice is legally required, and it explains to renters what their potential right to relocation assistance is if they give notice to vacate or vacate after receiving this increase. And the notice is available in Amharic, Chinese, Somali, Spanish, and Vietnamese at those links there. So no questions so far because I just have the screen open and I'm not hearing anything.
Yeah, we're not seeing a ton in chat right now.
Okay. So who's eligible for this economic displacement?
I'm sorry. Hi, my name's John Perkins. I did put a question in chat. David, I don't know if you saw it. Oh, Daniel, I'm sorry.
You can say your question. It's okay.
Yeah.
I've not seen it in chat, but you know, who knows, right? So go ahead.
John, and for everybody, and really, Dulcie, this is a question for you. How would you like to manage questions? Would you like to circle back for all of them that come in through the chat at the end, or would you like to have Alec let you know that a question has come in on a topic that you're currently speaking on?
I actually like to take questions as I go, as long as we're able to get through the content. But because there's, you know, we've had to limit the content because of the time restraints, I think we're good to take questions as we go. So just somebody can just say, "Hey, Dulcie, there's a question," and I can pause. So we can start with John if you'd like, and then I think I saw somebody else say they also had a question that they put into the chat.
Okay, and then Marilyn has raised her hand. So John Perkins, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Unmuted, I hope. Right
Yep.
here.
Yep.
Okay. So my question is, I'm in a condominium, and it's a homeowners association. Though not all the owners live here, and those who don't are renting their units. So when someone, we have an elevator for the residential floors, but there's a floor for the where you pick up your mail that is not wheelchair accessible. So the question is, who pays when a tenant needs a disability accommodation involving a condo's common area, if it involves changing not the unit itself, but something in the common area where the tenant has no financial relationship and has no lease agreement at all? And so that's my question. It potentially could be an issue within the condo I live in.
Oh, okay. Well, so I guess just for clarification purposes, we should probably stick to the content for questions initially, and then if you have specific questions about a you know, a specific scenario, we could sort of deal with that at the end. But since you've already sort of said what it is, there's a lot of things there. So just to be clear, you're the renter or you're the owner?
I'm in a condo. I'm a condo president.
Oh, okay. So you're the president of the HOA, and there's an issue with the tenant who wants a reasonable modification for access to their mailbox. Is that correct?
Um, they would need a modification to get to the mailbox. Yes. I don't know if it's
Okay.
reasonable or not, because this is hypothetical, but I can definitely see it potentially happening. So I'm just
Okay.
trying to understand where's the finances and payment for making that change. Fall.
Okay. Well, I really don't want to spend time on hypotheticals because this is real time, but just a quick answer is if the building is federally subsidized, um, then um, then the modification uh, cost would be connected to that. If it's not, and it doesn't sound like it is, because this is a condominium, then the modification cost would potentially be on the tenant. And basically, the requirement is that whoever is being asked for the modification or the accommodation, modification is a physical alteration, and the accommodation is more like a change to a practice, or maybe like making a special arrangement for mail collection for this person, but it's not a physical, alteration to something. The requirement is that the person who's in the position to consider the accommodation, the modification, has to just do that. They have to take it into account what the person's asking for, if it's possible to do it. If for example, it would require, the construction of a whole wheelchair ramp and multiple things like that, it probably would not be considered reasonable. But these are things that are sort of case by case basis. And so if somebody who had a disability was asking for an accommodation or a modification, and the landlord didn't engage, didn't give it proper consideration, that would be a potential violation. And then that person, the renter, could make a complaint to the Office for Civil Rights.
Okay.
John,
All
are
right.
you
Thank
able
you.
to see the
That's
chat?
clear.
John, I put a link to a resource on how reasonable, kind of what Dulcie was saying. It's
Yeah.
through Washington Law Help. Are you able to see that in the chat? The link?
Yes, from Alex.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah,
All
I
right.
do. Will the chat come through with the recording you're sending out?
We will be posting a recording. I don't have the URL right off the top of my head where it's going. We're still building that page, but if you've signed up here and we have your email address, you'll be notified that these recordings will be available. And I've just been told by my other technical producer, Wendy Shark, that yes, it will be available. I'm going to grab this link and I will put it into the chat again so that it is right at the very bottom of the chat. If you want to scroll down to the very bottom, you'll find it there.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm out.
Okay. And just to say that, the Office for Civil Rights, you can contact them for technical advice on any of those sort of ADA, Americans with Disability Act type of questions. They're the best technical advisors, and they're the ones that would be receiving any violation complaints. So they're a good resource. So was there another question that's related to the content? If it's not related to the content, then we can just put it at the end. We'll probably have some time to just answer whatever people want to talk about, but just for right now, we can get through the main content.
Yes, I actually asked 2 questions in the chat, and I don't know if you're seeing them because maybe my hand is not raised. But
Can you
one
identify yourself, please? And for Dulcie, who's actually presenting, all she sees is the content that she's presenting. Alec is monitoring the chat, so it may take a while for him to get there. But as you all speak, please identify yourself so everybody knows who you are.
My name is Jim, and one of the slides you showed is the unit ready for rent.
Mhm.
It refers to security entry locks and observation ports. Could
Mhm.
you explain what an observation port is?
Oh, of course. It's basically that little peep window, the little it's basically that little um I guess I don't know what to call it. Observation hole. It's that little, it's so that the tenant can see who's at the door,
Got
basically,
it.
without being seen by the person at the door. And that's actually required on all rental units. It's not something that's very well known, I find, but it's that's what that is.
Okay, thank you very much. And the second question is, all of these regulations that you're discussing here, do
Mhm.
they apply to renting out the basement in my house, which I'm remodeling right now so that I can rent it out?
Mhm. Yeah, so any rental, any time somebody rents a space to somebody else, these regulations apply. Now, there are special carve outs for landlords who live in the same unit as their renters. And that obviously is there to sort of protect a homeowner, because that's a different type of situation than somebody who owns a separate building and doesn't live with their tenants. Um,
Right.
so,
How would I find those special carve outs? Where would they be posted?
well, actually, I'm working on a document at the moment for that purpose, Jim.
Oh, okay, thank you.
So if you could just email me, and once I have that completed, I can always send you the link. So if you just email me my email address for anybody here who wants to contact me, and this is the same for any Seattle employee, City of Seattle employee, is my first name, dulcie.o'sullivan@seattle.gov. But I'll give you an example, a major example that would be significant, I think, for most owner occupiers. Um, the Fair Chance Housing ordinance, which prohibits landlords from running a criminal background check on tenants, would not apply to somebody who's renting a space in their own house. That's
Okay,
just a significant example of what would be a carve out for a owner occupier. But we can talk offline about this, Jim. And like I said, I'm working on a resource to put on the landlord portion of our Seattle.gov renting in Seattle website so that people can easily see, what additional sort of protections for an owner occupier landlord exist, um, at one easy glance.
okay, thank you very much. And could you please give your email address once again?
Sure. It's my first name, Dulcie, Dulcie, dot O'Sullivan, O'Sullivan, at seattle.gov.
Okay, thank you very much.
I've gone ahead and put Dulcie's email address in the chat, just to make it a little bit easier. Dulcie, we do have 3 folks who've had their hand up, one of them for a significant amount of time. I'd like to address these questions
Yep.
quickly to see if they are on topic. Marilyn, thank you very much for unmuting yourself. Quick question, if you would.
Yeah, I think there's some confusion about the chat. My chat to everyone is disabled. It says public chat is disabled. I'm also disabled from chatting back to Alec. So the only people I'm able to put any chat to is Dulcie and you, Daniel. So Dulcie's presenting. So I'm not sure if that's the case for everybody who's participating today, but I just wanted to say that because it seems like there's some confusion.
Correct. I'm not really seeing a whole lot of chat questions. And so I did try to reach out to privately to everyone that has their hand raised. I've tried to reach out privately. Maybe I'm not seeing.
I'm just unable to respond. I can't. The chat is disabled.
I understand, Angie, but I'm trying to also talk to the other presenters and Daniel, who's providing some of our support. So I understand you can probably go ahead with your question now, Marilyn.
Okay, so I have
Excuse me, Marilyn. I have just changed the chat settings so that it is now everyone. This is
Thank you, Dan.
not the way that we generally run public meetings, You all now have the opportunity to chat with each other. This is recorded and will be shared with part of the recording. So with that, Marilyn, your question, please.
Okay, and it would be helpful if SDCI staff, I know you have SDCI in your name, and so I could tell that you are, city employee. And so if there are other city employees who could put SDCI in, that would be very helpful to know who's official. My question was in the chat to you, Daniel, and it was basically just about these different types of relocation assistance payments. What is the payment? Like how is it calculated for each of these different types? Because it is different. And how is it split between the owner and the city? Because I believe that one of them the city shares in, but I'm not sure which other ones the city might participate in the payment.
Yeah, so when I went through, Marilyn, when I went through the different types, I explained that the development related relocation assistance is the only one where the city actually shares the cost, and that is pursuant to a state requirement. And that relocation assistance is only available to folks who are at 50% or below the median income. All the other relocation assistances that apply are all paid by the property owner 100%, when obviously applicable. The city will advance payment for economically displaced tenants and also for emergency orders, but will collect 100% from the property owner where applicable. Does that answer the question?
And what is the payment? Like, how is it calculated for those situations?
For the development related relocation assistance, it's a set amount and it gets indexed, I think, not every year, but every few years when everything else, when the cost of living and so forth is adjusted. I'm not quite sure how much it is. Alec, can you?
Yeah, so the tenant relocation assistance, it is yearly as HUD adjusts
okay.
our numbers.
It used to be.
I'm sorry?
I'm sorry, Alec. I was just musing to myself. It used to be as regular as every year that it was indexed, but
Sure.
Yeah.
We're trying to be, and I think that we may see, we've been told there's a lot of inflation and in the area, so that could cause an adjustment to the numbers, but that's all done by the HUD program, and we follow what HUD says for that. So, and that's a split cost. The city shares half the cost with the owner that wants to do the project. And then we have, of course, the emergency assistance. And as Dulcie mentioned earlier, it's a situation where it's a repair, a sort of emergency condition that's arisen where there's some kind of determination that it's an owner responsibility. So it doesn't apply in every case, but when it does, it is the owner's responsibility to pay for that. And then that's a set amount if the tenant is below 50% of area median income. And I'm going from the top of my head. I think it's still under $5,400, or twice the monthly income or rent if the tenant's over income. So if you have a tenant that pays $3,000 a month for their unit, it can actually be more if they're over 50% of area median income, but that'll be based on the amount of rent they're paying. So that's information the owner should have. An owner should know what their tenant's paying. If they're paying $1,700 a month, times 2, okay, $3,400. And then economic displacement relocation assistance for the eligible tenant who's at or below 80% of median income will be receiving 3 times their monthly housing costs, which the owner will know because the owner is collecting that money. Say it's $1,800 times 3 is going to be $5,600. So you should be able to always know what those costs are, right, Marilyn? I think we can proceed then.
Okay. So with regard to the economic displacement relocation assistance that we're focusing on now,
Dulcie, we do have another question from Dr. Howard Gale that came in, and then Angie is also wanting to make a question, ask a question, and then I think we should try to limit our questions until the end of your presentation.
Yeah, somebody's just expressed frustration that we're on the same slide, and they kind of want to move forward. Are the questions that are pending, are they about this particular, are they about EDRA? Are they about economic displacement? Because if not, I think I don't have too many more slides, and so we should get through this and then we can go back.
Perfect, Dulcie. I just wanted to set an expectation for the people who are waiting. That's all.
Yeah. Yep. Sorry, just bear with me. There's not a whole lot of slides left, and then we can really open up the floor to whatever as long as we answer the questions on the content. So the folks that would be eligible for economic displacement would have to be at 80% or below the average median income for the area, which, as Alec has said, is set by HUD every year. And you can see there to the side what that looks like in terms of household size. And they have to give notice to move or move after an eligible increase. And so this is the application process. This is how the application process works. And then we have a flow chart as well, just to show the timing. So when the department receives an application, we review it. If it does not have, if it's not complete, meaning it doesn't have the required documentation or information on it, then we let the tenant know, and they have 30 days then to provide that information. And then once we do have a completed application, we do the review and we notify the tenant by mail within 10 days whether they're eligible or not. Eligible households can receive a check within 14 days, and that will be about 3 times their monthly housing cost. And ineligible households can request an appeal within 10 days of being notified. The landlord also has a right to appeal once they're notified of payment that's due. And you can see here on the next slide, we'll just go closer into that process. So the tenant receives notice of the rent increase. The rent increase, remember, has to come with a 180-day advance notice. The rent increase goes into effect. And then on the application process, the tenant submits their application. The landlord's notified within 5 days that an application has been received, and then notified of the decision within 10 days after the application is complete. And if eligible, the landlord is notified and they make payment up to 3 times the monthly housing cost within 7 days of being notified. And then, of course, if they appeal, then that will mean that they have to go through a hearing process. So I think I saw the doctor's question pop up, and it was to do with development related question. We're at the end. I mean, simply, I would say, and of course, we don't know in our audience today whether we have landlords, tenants. I don't assume anything about our attendees today. That's why the content is fairly general. But I would always say to both landlords and tenants that just consider how the other person would feel in any given situation and respond accordingly. Most people are reasonable and approach situations accordingly. And that's what we encourage, because generally that will avoid any unpleasantness and our involvement in your lives, basically. But when in doubt, absolutely reach out, call the helpline. We are tremendously busy, I will say, and sometimes you do have to be patient, especially if you're not in an urgent situation. But we are there for guidance, and we do have language assistance. And we also have our Seattle.gov Renting in Seattle website, and for help from SOCR with stuff that's related to protected classes or fair housing law, that's a really useful email address for technical assistance. So that's all the slides I have. I would like to now answer the doctor's question and Angie's question, and then anybody else who's asking questions after that.
Dr. Gale?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep,
I can.
sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay. So I don't know how specific I need to get, but what I'm talking about is happening all across the city. It's happening in my particular building. 48 families are being displaced. And it has to do with the use of the TRAO as an end run around the EDRA. So just briefly, if a developer or landowner does minimal cosmetic refurbishments to a unit, but can claim to SDCI that it's over $6,000, requires relocation of more than 72-hour displacement, SDCI seems to be rubber stamping that. I have a rather horrific email I got from SDCI approving the TRAO in my building. And it's from Marine Road, and it's trying to justify what the landlord is doing in my building. And having lived in this building for 15 years and having gone through the renovations, I know this is actually 100% false. So my question is, what are the checks and balances against this rampant process of doing cheap, simple renovations that are purely cosmetic, are not necessary for health and safety, but are allowing landlords to displace people and raise the rent? And the last thing, I don't want to go on too long here, but I do want to point out that with a EDRA, you get a notice, and the day you get that increase, you have 6 months. You can plan your life around that. You can decide, I'm going to move in 6 months. With the EDRA, it is a nightmare. And the comment I put in really needs to be clarified. The hotline is useless. We got a notice in October from the landlord. We never heard anything. I just got a letter a week ago saying finally what the situation is. And I still don't know what the situation is. I have this arbitrary 90-day notice. I don't even know what it means. So again, there's not just an economic and a displacement disadvantage with the TRAO, but there's also a fear factor. People in my building are fleeing because they don't understand what the deadlines are. Again, unlike an EDRA. Thank you.
Okay, well, this is obviously a specific situation that's active. I'm not familiar with it, but it sounds like your building is going through the tenant relocation assistance ordinance process, and that is a 6-month process from when tenants are first notified to the time where they would be required to legally vacate the building. And so I think what you're saying is that your opinion, your feeling is that because EDRA, the Economic Displacement Relocation Assistance Bill, would cost more for the landlord to go through, that they're using the licensing process to pay less people and to get them out, even though the remodel or the substantial remodel, which is the reason for the license, you're saying doesn't exist because it's all cosmetic. Is that correct?
Sorry, yes, I put it in the chat. I don't know if you can read it.
Yeah, I don't see the chat because I have my slides up, so I actually have, I'm not seeing, I think it flashes up really briefly for me.
Sorry. Yeah. So you're correct. That's a fair recapitulation.
Right. So unfortunately, our staff, I mean, I get what you're saying. I mean, I can't speak to the veracity of it, but I get what you're saying. And there are those people out there who will abuse the regulations or try to find some way to get around them. And then, you know, sometimes we attempt legislation to sort of block that. That happened actually with the tenant relocation assistance ordinance, because we found people were raising rent rather than going through the licensing process to displace people, and then applying for permits after the fact. And so the trail avoidance bill was passed. But you know, to the degree that the staff have the authority to sort of say if somebody is being nefarious with their trail application, there's not a lot we can do. If they can apply for the permits properly and go through the process, I'm not sure that we can you know, we can run interference with that, because they're not necessarily, it's just one of those areas. So I'm not sure that we can do anything if that was happening, if that was actually what's going on. I'm not sure that we have any authority or any way to call that out. So you know, and again, I probably shouldn't speak any more on this, because this is a specific situation of which I am unaware. I think Alec could maybe follow up with you, just so that you have a little bit more, I don't know, maybe just understand more what our position is or what's happening. I certainly don't want you to feel the way you're feeling right now. Our department really does its very best to try and enforce what we are authorized to enforce, and or help people be informed about what's going on and what their options are. So I don't know, Alec, do you want to weigh in here at all? You probably are more familiar with the specifics than I am.
Yeah, and it does, well, we should probably follow up. It sounds like there has been some follow-up. I would say that it's not really, when a developer registers that they have indicated that they want to apply for TREO, they're not allowed to do rent increases while they're in the TREO process. So I don't think that EDRA or TREO should be really interacting, you know, and unless it's after the fact, and the, you know, process right now, there's a lot of pressure to get into the tenant relocation process right now. So an owner who applies for it, I mean, it can take months. And I think Dulcie mentioned this, it takes many months. It's actually at least a 5 to 6 month process. So there should be, you know, as you mentioned, the 90-day notice. And it is correct that we cannot, the SDCI does not have any regulation that it can enforce that tells an owner that they cannot remodel a unit. But there are these protections, however much more we would like to add to them. You know, it's still, you know, it's still 4 to 5 months, and tenants under 50% of area median income can get assistance if they apply. That's the best protections we have, you know, and we do enforce that to the maximum. You know, we follow the rules, and, you know, sometimes the rules we can question whether they should be better or more, but that's, anyway, I will try and follow up with you.
Alec, isn't it more like a year right now for the backlog to get one of those certificates? I mean, I've heard that it is an extensive wait time.
From the owner's perspective, yes, but from the tenant's perspective, they may not know that the owner has put in a request for TREO, right? So, like, a tenant might not be checking the portal and saying, "Oh, there's construction permit sitting on the website. So from the owner's perspective, that's absolutely correct. But from the tenant's perspective, they might not see or be aware of this until they get the tenant information packet. So
thanks, Alec. Yeah, because my point was, I mean, the allegation is that owners are using one to avoid the other. But I mean, the owner basically is lining up for longer than a year process. So, I mean, it's two different processes, but it takes a lot longer to get through a renovation relocation process. You have to wait for a certificate, and there's a significant backlog versus
Okay,
just
so-
issuing a rental.
so I'm trying. Remember what Dulcie said. Remember what
I'm
Dulcie.
sorry. I'm sorry, Marilyn. So, with all due respect, that's your opinion, okay? That's your opinion, and we're not here to really discuss opinions.
Well,
So,
thanks, Dulcie. I was just asking what the backlog is.
And Dulcie made a good point about perspectives, right?
so basically, if there is a backlog for the development related relocation, it's because there's just the demand outweighs the resources to serve it, and you know that's just that's just the reality of the situation.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I do have to interject here because
Mhm.
this is just not an accurate telling. So I will explain. I monitor the permits on the SDCI website. At the end of October is when it was first applied for. It was granted within less than 90 days. And I want to point out here, here's the inequity. This isn't, you know, let's have even-handed treatment of tenants and landlords. Because in fact, all the resources from SDCI went into expediting that permit. Yet there are 48 families in my building and nobody got any feedback. What we got was a 2-hour window of someone from SDCI coming into our building in the middle of the day when people work. No one was answering phone calls. No one was answering emails. People still have questions. So all the resources are going to expediting these permits, and absolutely nothing is going to the people that are affected. And again, I think my question was misunderstood. The way that the TRAO is an end run around the EDRA is that it's actually just about as quick, but it allows a landlord to do it in bulk. So instead of having to do unit by unit in terms of rent increases, they can simply do it to the whole building. They pay far less money. They're going to pay typically about anywhere from half to 60% of the relocation fee. And they're probably going to have to give it to virtually no tenants because of the stricter income guideline and because of the way the income guideline is arbitrated. Most people end up not applying for it. So there's a lot of misinformation here, and I do object to it as someone who has lived in a building for months now and actually watched it unfold. Thank you.
Okay, so Dr. Gale, I appreciate what you're saying. I will say though that there's absolutely no way that the ordinance would be administered by our staff that would allow the timelines to be reduced for a developer or a property owner, because that's just not how the process works. And I want you to know also that the permitting is a whole other level of activity that our particular department, the code compliance department, doesn't. We don't run that. They're our colleagues, but they're in a completely different area. So the permitting part is quite separate to the requirement to get a license in order to legally displace a tenant. And the 6-month timeline is absolutely adhered to. Sometimes a landlord can be super efficient. They generally aren't, where they can sort of serve the tenant packet and you know sort of expedite things, but generally that's not our experience. So there's some confusion going on here between what has happened and what has happened, or what the process is. And I would like for you to have a clear understanding of what has been processed on the department side, so that you know that from our perspective, we've enforced the ordinance as it's written. Um, and I don't, maybe there's an opportunity here for us to come out again to the building and talk to folks not during the workday. Um, maybe that's something we can do. That's a lot of families that are being impacted. So we can look into that. If you want to talk to me offline about that, I'd be happy to come out there and talk to folks and try and answer questions, because whatever happens, people should be clear on what's happening to them, what's impacting them, and what their options are. So I see your comments, but again, we have to, we can absolutely look at the day the license application was made, when tenants were first notified, because all of that is required as part of the licensing process. The owner has 30 days to serve the notice and so on and so forth. So yeah.
I've sent a message to the manager of my unit, so that we can follow up on Monday with Dr. Gale.
Okay.
We probably do have some need to, we kind of have the economic displacement is kind of our centerpiece, and we haven't maybe addressed it enough. And so, Dr. Gale, I want you to know that we're going to try and follow up with you on Monday. So if we're moving on, I don't want you to feel like we're, giving you short shrift. But I wanted to just jump in and maybe give Dulcie a chance to maybe shift to other questions, etc.
Okay. Thank you, Alec.
Alec, thank you very much. Angie G, you've had your hand up for an incredible amount of time. You should be able to unmute yourself and ask a question. I appreciate your patience.
Hi there. Thank you very much. I have a variety of questions. I'm going to paste a few more in the chat, but I had one from much earlier on when there was mention that Dulcie is working on a special carve-out document for landlords who live in the same unit as their tenant. Mm-hmm. And I see there's been some other questions in the chat about backyard cottages and which rules apply. So I'm just curious about the scope of that document, and to really clarify the terms like owner occupier and shared housing. There's a real difference between someone who's renting rooms in the house that they live in versus someone who has like a mother-in-law apartment in the same house, but it's a separate unit, or someone who has a backyard cottage that's a separate structure on the same property. And there's a lot of confusion about which rules apply. And there's so many new pieces of legislation moving through talking about missing middle housing and people wanting to add more housing on small properties. I think it's really important that we know which current rules do apply to people. So I'm wondering if you can clarify some of those terms, let us know what information is currently available and what the scope of that new document is that you're working on. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. And Angie, sorry you had to wait that long to speak. Basically, you're right. It is very confusing. It's confusing for us who work with the subject matter for decades, because of the profusion of regulations, and because there are so many different situations now with how people are using their properties and how they're set up, and also just the proliferation of detached accessory dwelling units and detached accessory dwelling units. So some of the technical areas I would not be confident in answering right now. That's part of why I committed to creating the document. We'll just call it a document, but it's basically going to be a page on the website. And hopefully I'll be able to detail everything that you've described. So for people who are, like you say, sharing rooms in their house, which is a much more immediate sort of situation than somebody who has, a 10,000 square foot lot and they have a detached accessory dwelling unit, on the same property line. So that's my goal, is to answer all of those questions and make it clear for folks who are in any of those situations, either renting rooms and or next door or basement or whatever it is. And so that's my goal, is to make all of that very clear. I know it's very, very needed.
So Dulcie, we certainly have a lot of questions in the chat.
Mhm.
I think that it may be quick and easy. We still have about 22 minutes. If people would like to ask a question, a new
I
question, we
I
could use the
actually
raise
do.
hand tool.
Yeah. Everybody's welcome to ask questions. I do see Angie's thing popped up here. Um, you need to talk to Jeff about the stakeholder material because he's the one who's managing that. And I don't know that it's been made publicly available, Angie, but I think that would be a question for Jeff. Just for those people who are in the room still, I mean, attending this, Marilyn and Angie are folks that we have worked with before through a landlord stakeholder process. And so that's why we're familiar with each other. And that's why their questions are pretty informed and specific. So anything else?
Yeah, Dulcie. So I wanted to, so Diane asked a question about, can I evict a tenant for not paying rent myself, or do I need to use a lawyer? I mean, I know that's kind of a classic question for us. Do you want to jump on that one, or do you want me to just roll with it?
Well, would you like to? Would you like to roll with it?
Well, I would just say my opinion is that if you go, it depends on your appetite for if you believe the tenant, you can always do a notice, you can always do a pro se lawsuit, but you can also get an attorney. An attorney can, you know, probably I would always STCI would always say an attorney is a good idea. Do you have anything to add to that, or?
I do. I think absolutely don't do it yourself because there are so many hazards and trips and the all renters who cannot afford an attorney have an automatic right to counsel now. And that those attorneys will be looking for the low hanging fruit, as it were. So any technical errors you make in your summons or your paperwork or your notice, all of those things could substantially delay you and cost you more in the end. So if I, as a landlord myself, was looking to try and evict a tenant, I would absolutely get a landlord tenant specialist attorney in the city to tell me how to proceed. And there are, I think, ways you can be economic. I mean, if you can do some of the early service notice stuff yourself, but again, if it's toward the objective of evicting somebody, you absolutely need a legal expert on your side, and it will be money well spent. So I would advise nobody to try and evict somebody themselves because I just
SDCI can't provide you legal advice either.
right.
And so, you know, you're really going to be on your own. Randall had a question about, and I don't think this is maybe the most apropos question, but it's to what, you know, for what we do, but to what extent do the SDCI renting standards apply to VRBO, Airbnb? This is a discussion about landlord tenant, and those situations are not normally landlord tenant, so there can be some complications there. But do you have anything to add to that, Dulcie?
Yeah, so the short-term rentals are not something that we enforce around, but it can be complicated because if somebody is renting a place for 30 consecutive days or more, then technically they are considered tenants and they are considered tenants with, with the rights of every tenant that is in Seattle. So the short-term rentals are not something that we regulate, but potentially if there was some kind of dispute and we were able to establish that a tenancy existed, then everything would apply. So that's kind of the best answer that I can give.
And then It looks, now there's a question from, I haven't had a chance to look at this yet, so I'll just read this from Dirk Farnes at renter applicant checks no pets on the application as well as signed lease, as well as verbally. When asked if they had any pets, she moved in with a very large dog and said it was an emotional support animal. I did not. Okay, and so I simply asked for a certification. So it looks like this is sort of a pet question where the owner is just trying to ask for information about the pet, perhaps, and sort of getting, no response from the tenant. They might want to, I'm guessing, Dulcie, they might want to, and I think you have, I'm not expert on that because that's sort of a civil rights question.
Yeah. So I'll speak to that. So basically, a pet and a service animal are completely different things as far as the rental housing laws are concerned. So when you ask if somebody has a pet and they have a service animal, then I guess it's not dishonest to say I don't have a pet. I mean, they could at that point, I guess, volunteer that they have a service animal, but we have heard from people with disabilities that sometimes they find that the landlord will suddenly not want them to rent if they do say that they have a service animal up front. So maybe that's what went on here. But as far as your rights, the tenant has a right to have a service animal, and you do have a right to ask for a certification that the animal is a service animal and is necessary for the person's disability. And so the certification, though, could be from a medical practitioner, it could be from a family member, it could be from anybody that knows the person and knows the connection between the person's disability and the service animal. But I think for you, the best thing to do is, if you're looking for technical advice around service animals, and be very careful because this is around disability rights, call or email the SOCR, Seattle Office for Civil Rights, and get some technical assistance with how to go about properly asking for certification and what you can expect. But I will say the regulations and the laws and the protections around service animals in Seattle are very broadly construed in favor of the tenant and their right to a service animal. So I will say that, but I would reach out to the Office for Civil Rights for technical assistance on how to go about getting certification from the tenant without putting yourself at risk of any fair housing violation.
Now, Dulcie, Angie did ask some rather high-level questions, and I mean, they're just maybe not exactly things that we sort of are preparing, like, except this one question: is it possible for small landlords to ask questions of SDCI anonymously? And if you don't mind, could I jump on that one really quick?
Of course.
Yeah, so I would say all of our work is subject to public record, so I can't do anything as a city employee anonymously. So, however, if you call and you don't want to attach an inquiry on renting in Seattle, the 206-684-5700 number, you can say, just, give a name and a number for a callback. And then, we endeavor to call you back and address your questions. In that sense, there's no ability for us to enforce on we go by address. And it is quite common for me to call people back about, hey, you have questions about a rent increase that you want to give, for instance. I don't have an address on a customer visit, is what we call it. That's just a technical term. where the record is not attached to an address, that may not, be sufficient anonymity, but I don't know what, and you can always, come to things like this, and we're going to have a home fair in 2 weeks, at the Filipino Community Center, and you could just come up to the table and ask questions. So there's opportunities if you're, ultra concerned about the anonymity. And then I think a couple of the other questions would require us to talk about things about a question about utilities. And I apologize. I think these questions might be a little beyond the scope. And then this next question I haven't read yet, Dulcie, so you might be, so let's see who's got this one. As a renter for 3/4 of my life, now moving into being a landlord, I am concerned about unintended consequences of the new rental regulations and protections for small landlords. I support rental regulations and protections, but I'm concerned about abuse and losing this new property because of it. Is this perspective being considered? Do you want to take that one, Dulcie, or?
Sure. I mean, Carol, yeah, I mean, we're all aware of how sometimes there are unintended consequences. And certainly some of the more recent legislation has proven, difficult for our department and for our staff to even, navigate, never mind standing up and enforcing. And so it can be a challenge, all around. But, I would say in general, it is a more complicated endeavor now to rent, and there are some regulations that would seem to, how would I say, maybe increase the risk, the financial risk for somebody who wanted to be a landlord. But at the same time, I would say these are sort of those general fears and anxieties. I would say for the most part, if you have the capacity, you can be successful. And, I'm a landlord in Seattle, and I'm certainly not wanting to sell my property or get out of the renting business. I think that if you do have feedback about the regulations, that's something that's useful to give to your elected officials, because they're the ones that decide what the priorities are in terms of regulations and what they want to do. But I would say just, if you do the best you can, and follow the rules, I really don't see that there's much to be so concerned about. So
And I would also add to that, I do enforcement, and of the rules, but I'm sure maybe there's an exception, but I mean, we always ask for voluntary compliance. So we've introduced a lot of regulations in the city, or I should say the council and the mayor have introduced a lot of regulations, and then we are sort of implementing, and we know that they're difficult to follow. And I share that perspective in enforcement. This is a tough thing. And you just, rescind this notice. You probably, you needed to give 6 months notice of a rent increase. Just take it back. And in those calls, we're always providing an education component. So the idea is for people to feel, when they're ready to become, like Dulcie said, like this is almost not unlike a small business. You've taken on this big endeavor. We want to support you and help you get it right. So hopefully, and I always try in my calls to, be supportive. I mean, even if I'm having to tell you that something went wrong, I want you to succeed, and, it's the regulations are difficult, but they're also, adding value, making Seattle a very attractive place for tenants to live. So
I have to say, If you can hear me, right? This is Carol. I want to thank Dulcie and SDCI for taking the time on a Saturday to provide this information for us. And I think you guys, are right. Everyone's trying to do their best that they can. There are a lot of horror stories out there, and one always hopes that they're not going to be involved in one. And I really do appreciate SDCI really, trying to take a gentle hand and work with everyone on this. I just add that I was a rent stabilized renter for 20 years of my life, so I'm certainly not sympathetic going into being a landlord, but there's some really horrifying stuff out there. And so I just, I'm not sure where the best place is to make my voice heard for making sure both sides of the equation are considered. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And just to answer that one question you had about creating an ADU in a finished basement and the permitting process. So as far as the physical permits to put in a basement, you should talk to your contractor or whoever is performing the construction, because they should be aware of the building requirements.
To be honest, it's a finished basement, and it's us. It's my husband and I so far, and we're doing the things like, walls and floors and changing, sink vanities, that kind of stuff. There's not a horrendous amount of stuff, but I
Yeah,
do.
so the thing that I would say is that it's the thing with basements especially is the egress issue and how high the windows are from the floor, and is there alternative egress and that kind of thing. And if you don't know the construction,
I'm on all of that already. Nope. I'm in
okay,
it. I'm
okay.
on it.
So as far as registering it for a rental unit, then you would just, well, you'd establish you can establish it for the use. So you would just go into the SDCI and get a permit, and then somebody would inspect it and it would be established for the use. So then it would be on the record that you had a permitted accessory dwelling unit. And then you would register it if you wanted to rent it out at that point.
Okay. All right. Super. Thank you so much for that. I'll put myself back on mute. Thanks again, you guys.
Right. And thanks for the thanks. And I would just encourage you all, landlords and tenants alike, to just, communicate with your elected officials or join advocacy groups. I know Marilyn and Angie have a landlord group. If you were interested in becoming part of that, I don't know what it takes to be a member, but there are lots of folks out there that are sharing your concern, and just also join a landlord agency like Rental Housing Association. That will also help you with the paperwork that you need, and to sort of stay abreast of developing legislations at the city and state level. So I would encourage any landlords here or wanting to be landlords to join the Rental Housing Association. They're a good group for advocating for landlords. Any more questions? We have about 4 minutes left, so I thank you for your attention. If there's anything you guys want to follow up with, please do reach out to us. My email address is in the chat, I believe, and Alex also. Come to our in-person home fair later this month. Alec, do you remember what date Wendy, Alec, what date it's on? I'll actually be on vacation, so I'm already there mentally.
It's the 11th, so it'd be the 25th, Filipino Community Center from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. There'll be multiple tables there, and like our person who's got the ADU question, because we're sort of wanting to toss to someone who's not here, which might be someone in the permitting area. I believe there will be, I can't vouch for everyone that'll be there, but I think it'll be many parts of SDCI will be there. So that would be a great opportunity, to get that type of question where you're.
Hey, Alec, it'll be
Yes.
it'll be most of SDCI as well as several other city departments like City Light, SDOT, SPU, Office of Housing.
And that would also go to an earlier chat question about utilities question that I think I can't remember which person was posing that, but like you're saying, Wendy, that the utilities are going to be there, so that it's going to be a good event for anyone that's got like a wide range of issues.
Yeah, it is, and it's a really wonderful opportunity to get free access to all of these technical experts that would ordinarily be difficult to reach. So anybody with questions about permitting, engineering, and then of course all our other colleagues across the other departments, street use, alleys, all of that stuff, utilities, that will also, there'll be staff there available. So we would encourage anyone who has any questions or interest in any of this to attend and get your questions answered. And we also are giving out some renters handbooks and some promotional items as well for the Renting in Seattle program. So please do come down on that date and partake. But I think I'm going to wrap this up now. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Please follow up if there are any outstanding questions or comments. We really appreciate you, and enjoy the lovely springish day.
And there's a survey too, just a quick thing that you can click on that Wendy put in the chat.